Well, all right, let's just get started and people can join as they would like. As I'm catching my breath, my name is Ryan Brondike, not Ryan West as the screen shows, but I work at West Music. I am the category manager for guitar and all things combo, and extremely excited to be here with Austin Sandick today from the New York City band Dhärä, and he's also a product specialist for Boss guitar pedals.
Hey, everybody.
And so he's just kind of going to talk for about an hour about pedals, signal flow, looping, just anything that seems relevant to anybody here that's getting started on pedals. If you have questions, you can feel free to pop in the chat and ask the questions. And at the end, we'll have an actual Q&A. So if your question seems a little too in-depth, we might get to that later. But any questions that come up during this class, just feel free to ask, and then we'll get to it at some point. And yeah, this is going to be recorded, so we'll have it on YouTube later. So if you forget something, just check it out on YouTube later. We'll send you a link.
Awesome. Sounds great.
Cool. And then, yeah, I'll probably just mute for now, but I may pop in and out. But yeah, go ahead, Austin. Thanks so much for being here today.
Cool. Thank you, Ryan, for letting me on this, and thank you everybody for coming. So as Ryan said before, I play with a band called Dhärä. We play mostly like progressive instrumental rock stuff, and I have been with Boss for about 7 years now. I was a product specialist, and now I'm mainly in product support. So if you have used Roland or Boss backstage to ask technical questions about any of our products, you're probably talking to me. So getting past that, the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of signal flow and just effects pedals and all of that in general is that there's no right or wrong way to use effects pedals. It's just whatever you feel is creative. I kind of like to think of them as like paints that I have that I can put onto a canvas and make an image. So like in that respect, it's like, all the different pedals and effects are the different colors that I have access to paint my music or to like, imprint on my music. So that's the first thing that I wanted to get out of the way, which was that, there's no right or wrong way of using effects. There's no right or wrong order. There's no right or wrong signal flow. Sure, there's like some guidelines to get you to possibly the sounds that maybe you're looking for, but never underestimate unconventional ways of getting something, because modern times require modern solutions. So that's always a big plus. So the way I like to think about effects is that I like to think of them as dynamic-based effects, and then I have time-based effects. So dynamics being that they will change the way the dynamic of the instrument works. So things like compressors and overdrive pedals, EQ, volume pedals also are all categorized in the as what I would like to put it as the dynamic. So dynamic pedals, I like to have them closer to my guitar because that's where all my picking dynamics is coming from my hands. So if I want to be more dynamic with my pedals, I want to have those dynamic pedals closer to the input jack or the jack coming out of my guitar. So in convention, I'd typically like to use a compressor on clean guitars and then turn off the compressor when I'm using like overdrive pedals or like the second channel on my amp, which in turn is actually another effect to get a type of distortion sound, but it's actually done a little bit differently, which is very, very interesting. I can talk about gain stage all day, but we're talking about signal flow. So basically dynamic stuff, you want to put it closer to where the instrument input or the instrument output jack is coming from. And then you have time-based effects. So time-based effects are going to be things like modulation or chorus effects, delays, reverbs, things that recreate spaces, all of those type of effects. Tremolos I would also consider to be a time-based effect, because literally you're manipulating the timing or the stretching of that instrument by using delayed time in order to give you more of a recreational or a recreation of a space. So I like to put those as close to the end of my signal chain as possible. So those things aren't really affecting like my gain staging or my dynamics. I just like to put those at the very end. So in typical signal flow, if I have the option to have an effects loop on my amp, I like to put delays, reverbs, and modulation into the effects loop. Phaser is the only thing that I think is more of a dynamic effect than it is an actual time-based effect, even though according to science, phasers are actually time-based effects. But again, that's personal preference. And like I said earlier, there's no right or wrong way of using effects or having a signal flow. It's just whatever your personal preference is, and allow yourself to have enough experimentation with that to kind of decide like what you kind of want and what ultimately just works for the way that you play. Certain players like certain orders of effects or certain ways that they run signal flow because it matches the way that they like to approach the instrument and how they work best. And that takes, sometimes it could take you a couple of months. Sometimes it takes people years to figure that out. And I've been playing for, oh man, the better part of 17 to 18 years, is coming on 20. So originally I started playing when I was about 9, 10. And my stepdad at the time was turning me on to like, classic rock and roll. I was listening to a lot of the John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, Jimi Hendrix, and all that stuff. And so my first pedals that I ever got were a Blues Driver and a Crybaby Wah. And I was borrowing my friend's twin reverb, and I was using my uncle's old SG. It was a Lyle SG. It was like some cheap Chinese knockoff kind of thing for an SG, but it was the only electric guitar that I had. So I was using that in conjunction with those two pedals to try and do the classic rock thing. And over the years of playing a wah pedal, I realized that I sucked at it. I was terrible at using a wah pedal, and I never got the sound that I really wanted. So I put down the wah pedal for the better part of maybe like 10 to 12 years. And then it wasn't up until maybe a couple of months ago where I decided to use, and I'll show you this pedal board in just a second after I go over a couple other boards that I've done, is that there's a wah on this pedal board that I started using for a couple of jams and some sessions. And finally, I learned how to get the effect that I wanted 12 years ago that I really wanted. I finally got it now. So allow yourself to give yourself time with your effects and to give yourself, a little bit of leeway, because every effect has a little bit of a learning curve, whether it's, something as complex as like a multi-effects or like a GT1000 or something like that, all the way to something simple as like, a tuner or maybe an overdrive pedal. Maybe it needs to be played a certain way. Maybe it needs to be put into the signal a certain way. You never really know until you give yourself enough time in order to like play around with those things and experiment. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to get out of the way. The next thing I wanted to show you guys, I'm going to show you some pictures of some really, really old pedal boards I've done from way back in the day. So I'm actually going to start with a more recent pedal board that I did. So the one that you're looking at now, this is the one that I use with my band Dhärä. So this is like my touring board. This is the one I use live. In the studio, I never really like to use a pedal board. Sometimes I like to just use a couple of pedals on the ground that I need for the sound that I want, and then mostly try to get my tones from my amp for recordings. But for live, since I'm using a lot of post effects and things like that, I tend to use this to get all of those sounds. So what you're looking at here, got a delay pedal here, a DD500. I also have the GT1000 core. This is where I'm getting all of my other modulation effects, my EQ. It's also changing the channels on my amp as well as doing MIDI stuff. DL4, this little green box over here with a Rick and Morty family on it, if anybody's a Rick and Morty fan. But I mainly just use this as a single track looper. So basically I have like a record, play once, and then there's like some effects for looping. Expression pedal changes what it actually is supposed to do in the GT1000 core. I have it doing a bunch of different stuff. And then this little black box on the bottom here with the 6 buttons, this is a Morningstar MC6. So this is just a generic MIDI controller that I use to basically sync everything together, so that way I only have to hit one button for clean, one button for crunch, and then one button for like my lead and my solo tones. And that way I can get all the sounds that I want literally just by pressing one button, and I can focus on the parts that I have to play, because sometimes the music from Dhärä gets a little bit complicated in that regard. So now moving forward with a couple of other ones, this board here, this is the one you're probably going to be listening to when I get into a couple of sound examples. This is the board that just lives underneath my desk. This is like my demo tracking board. This is like my idea board. This just runs directly into my interface. I have all the amps and effects that I need, and I can control them using an app, which I'll show you in a bit. A couple of older ones. Let's see if I can find one of my original ones. Here we go. So this is a board that I built in, I want to say, circa 2005, maybe 2006. I was using this board with a touring punk band that a drummer buddy of mine that we went to college with. He needed a sub guitar player for that tour, so I decided to put together this board based upon the sounds from their record and just built that. And honestly, if you look at this signal flow, you can clearly tell I had no idea what I was doing. Like the whammies all the way at the end. I have a phaser after my delays. I have like a tremolo just stuck in the middle for like no reason. There's a fuzz before my compressor. Like this thing is all kinds of weirded out. But it got me the sounds I was looking for. And this was also at a time where I didn't really understand signal flow. So again, if you're coming from a place where you don't really understand it, or like, you're having a hard time getting the sound you're looking for, again, sometimes it just requires a little bit of time and patience to kind of get you through, or basically get you what you're looking for. This was basically the second iteration of that board, and as you notice, I started getting more into Boss pedals as I played a little bit more. Still have this RC3. It actually survived a hurricane, along with this DD3 as well. But this was one of the boards I used for one of my other prog bands, and The Day Is Mine. Again, I tried shrinking it down, keeping it really, really simple, and all that stuff. So, and here we go. So we start getting a little bit more into some of the boards I did for Boss demos. So the one you're looking at here is actually the one I did for Summer NAMM when we released the CE2W pedal. And I was the demo point guy that did all of the demos for the CE2 for all like the video and the media, like, Guitar Player and Guitar World and Reverb and all those guys would basically be coming to me saying like, demo this pedal. So like I would, using this setup. And I'm a big fan of loopers, as you can tell. I'm using two of them here simultaneously, and if you go into the Summer NAMM releases, or the live videos from Summer NAMM for the release of the CE2W, you'll notice I'll be using both of these at the same time, and then I add individual stop switches. I was also using MIDI to sync a clock to tap out tempo on a delay, and a couple of other things here. So again, really, really cool, really fun doing that. This is another Boss board that I did for our release for the SY200 and the IR200. Funny enough about this is actually on one of the newer pedal boards. This is on a BCB 1000, our kind of like suitcase style pedal board, which is very, very cool. I actually enjoy that case a lot. But yeah, I was basically using this to demo out these. The IR200 is kind of a built-in amping cabinet, which I actually have on this board, which I'll show you in a minute. And then the MS3 on the bottom, I wasn't using any effects or anything from the MS3. I was using it as a MIDI controller to control the drummer inside the RC5 here, and also to change patches on the SY200 and the IR200. So I definitely dive super deep into MIDI when it comes to controlling everything. This board here is what I use with my Katana Mark 1, because I bought a Katana Mark 1 when it first came out because I loved it, and it was really easy, really simple to set up. So this is just a little mini board that I have to just hook it up to that. I bring it out to a couple of jams and things. This one is another demo board that I did for Boss when we released the BCB 90X. This is another one that we did when I was doing trainings for a couple of stores on ES8 and effect switchings and MIDI and stuff like that. And this is one of the earlier iterations of my board I use in my band Dhärä. And funny enough, I don't have a picture of it, but there's actually a compressor underneath this MS3 little switcher up top here, so kind of hard to tell, but yeah, so that's basically just some of the boards I've done in the past, which again are really, really fun in terms of how they run and how they signal flow. But you notice like everything kind of like changes over time, and you're kind of noticing like, okay, things are getting bigger, things are getting smaller, things are getting added, things have this type of purpose and this type of purpose, and I always think that's a really good way of approaching pedal boards, is like kind of figuring out a purpose for what your effect chain needs to be. It's like, all right, I'm trying to do this thing, then I want to set up my board this way, and I need these types of effects. So, and you kind of pick and choose. It's like, well, can I get them all out of a multi-effects, or could I get them all out of using the individual compact pedals that I have? And that's partially in why I use a GT1000 for writing down, like recording my ideas and basically printing my ideas to use for later records and stuff like that, just because it's really, really easy and it's really simple. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my cam up here, and yeah, you see my fresh cup of coffee here. Before I show you guys the GT1000, and I'm actually using the app with the GT1000 to get all my sounds and change my sounds and stuff, but I did want to show you guys this pedal board here that I recently built. This thing, this is basically my all-inclusive board. This is my all-in-one. I use this for pretty much every other gig that I have that's not a band gig with my band Dhärä. So basically, this thing has a lot of interesting things going on it. I have a MS3 down here. This is the MS3 you saw in some of the other pictures. And basically, I'm using really, really basic effects. I have a tap tempo here. I have 2 different delays. And then I also have a button to turn on the wah. And then this expression pedal controls the wah. And then basically I have a octave pedal here, phaser, boost. I very rarely actually use this boost. I was kind of thinking about taking it off, just to save some space. Am I right? I use a JB2. This is probably one of my favorite overdrive pedals. And then I have the JB2 hooked up to this little switch here. So when I turn it on, I can actually change the gain stage using this little remote switch here. So I can change it from the Boss overdrive, the blues driver side, to the red, which is the JHS Angry Charlie side. And then I have this little 2-button guy here. This just turns on a couple of other auxiliary effects inside of the MS3, just for me to use, like a modulation. I think I put a chorus and a tremolo on there. And then this is my amp. So this is my little amp in a box. This is an IR200. I did a couple of amp models in there just to run them directly into the PA, and it sounds great. It sounds fantastic. But the other thing that I wanted to show you is not importantly just from what's going on the top, but I wanted to show you what was going on the back of this pedal board. So if I flip this over, as long as I don't knock everything over, you see my band logo there. So basically what you're looking at, the back of the pedal board, right? So I got the power supply here. And then I got this thing over here, which has all these like color-coded like little jacks here. So basically what these are doing, this is allowing me to reroute all of the signal from the MS3 to different places on my pedal board or to different output sources. So I have an in here for a stereo DI box, which the amplifier section lives on top of, or the little IR200 here, so I can run an amp directly into the PA system, which is great. It also has an effects loop, so I'm actually running 4-cable method, which I can explain about 4-cable method in a bit if you have any questions about it. And I'm basically running a 4-cable method into the amp, which allows me to put delays, like delay pedals on all my time-based effects, right? All the time-based effects, we want to put them as close to the end of the signal chain as possible, or after the preamp of the amplifier, which is a dynamic effect, or what I would categorize as a dynamic type of effect. And I basically run that into the effects loop here, so that way all of the delays are technically coming after the preamp of this little amplifier box, which is actually very, very cool. And I can take this little junction box back here. I can basically just unplug these and reroute these basically to different slots, just to route them to different things. So if I want to run directly into the input of an amp, or if I want to use a 4-cable method with another amp, or if I'm running direct out, and this also can do stereo because these outputs are actually TRS. So I could run stereo out of my MS3 into the IR200, and I can get full stereo effects, which is actually very, very cool. So was kind of happy when I finally put this together, because now I have one board that I just grab and I just go and basically just do the gig for whatever gig I need, and this basically has all of my effects in it. The last thing it doesn't have is MIDI, which I am getting around to. So basically the MIDI section, what it would do is it would allow me to change patches here, and it would change the amplifiers up here. But I'm still waiting on the last little cable to fix that up. Any questions so far? I know I went over like a lot of stuff in terms of like just like, you know, like my past pedal boards and stuff like that, and a little bit about signal flow. So now I am ready to show you guys a couple of sounds here.
Can you define the 4-cable method for us?
Yeah, sure. So 4-cable method, and this basically works on an amplifier that has an effects loop, right? So on the back of an amp, sometimes you'll see a send and a return. And what those are is basically just input and output jacks that can go past the preamp of the amplifier. So think of the preamp and the power amp of an amplifier being 2 different sections, right? The power amp goes to the speaker. Preamp is where you're getting the gain from, right? The distortion. And basically the effects loop kind of lives in between those two. So it allows me to patch in a delay in between my preamp and my power amp. And the reason why you want to do stuff like that is because if I was feeding delay directly into a distorted preamp, right, that would mean that every repeat of that delay would be distorted. And if you add more distortion on top of another distorted circuit, you're getting a lot of extra noise and extra feedback noise and stuff, and it might not be exactly desirable. So putting time-based effects in between your preamp and the power amp section and just injecting them in the middle works really, really well. This is actually very important for those that are actually using loop pedals. And basically it allows you to put effects past the preamp, so that way you can change channels on the amp, you can make a clean loop, and then you can change channels on the amp to a distorted sound and have the looper stay as a clean sound. But 4-cable method, it basically just means that you're running 4 cables, right? You're running 1 cable out of your guitar into an effect, and then out of that effect into the input of your amp. And then the send and return of that amp comes back into that pedal and then goes back and then comes back into the amp. So basically I can take the preamp of my amp and I can move it around in terms of where it sits in versus to my time-based effects as well as my other dynamic effects. I hope that makes sense. But 4-cable method can be applied in like a couple of different ways, especially if you're using like a multi-effects or like I'm using like a switcher. But 4-cable method basically just references that you can put effects past the preamp of your amp. And the only way to achieve 4-cable method is by using the effects loop of an amp. So if your amp doesn't have an effects loop, you can't use 4-cable method because everything's just running linear into the input as opposed to having an additional input and output on that amp past the physical amp's input. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for breaking that down.
Yeah, and dissecting that. It's really important for loopers to do that, to have an amp with an effects loop, to use a looper. And this is kind of partially why, like, you know, when people ask me like, oh, you use a Katana, like how come you went for the 100-watt? And I told them that I needed the effects loop. That's literally the main reason. And the main reason is because I do a lot of looping. So if you were to run a looper directly into the input of an amp that has 2 channels on it, right? Like let's say you have a clean and a distortion. If I took a looper and I recorded a clean guitar track, right? So my amp channel is set to clean, and I'm recording that loop, and that loop is getting fed into the input of the amp, right? If I change channels on that amp, that means that the loop is distorted along with the input signal of my guitar, right? So in certain cases, I don't want that. I want to have a clean loop while I change channels to a distorted sound on my amp, and still have that loop be clean. And in order to do that, you would need to have the looper live past the preamp or the channels on your amp. So basically, it keeps the loop clean while actually keeping everything else dirty that's before the looper. So for example, right, I'm just gonna go on my GT1000 here, since my looper block here actually is actually movable inside the GT1000, which is actually very cool. So I'm just gonna do chain edit here. I'm gonna press and edit this guy. All right, so I'm gonna take my looper and I'm gonna run it right here. So if I do that, right, that means that the looper is running directly into the input of the amp. And let's say that like my distortion channel is by using this distortion pedal, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make a quick loop. All right, so I got my loop in there. Now, let's say I change channels on my amp, right? Notice the loop is distorted. And if I play on top of it, everything kind of gets a little bit muddy, right? So technically, I want to have this looper live past the preamp section, right? So in order to do that, we're just going to go ahead and hit chain edit here, and we're going to put the looper back towards the end of the signal chain. And now when I play that loop back, it also recorded my input as opposed to recording the preamp. So I'm just going to make that loop again. And now when I change my channel here, right, if I turn on distortion, the loop stays exactly the same, and I can play a distorted lead on top of it. And again, so that's like kind of like the importance of why, like, you know, when you're using a looper, to have it past the preamp of your amp and use it with an effects loop. And since we're talking about looping, if anybody here is new to looping or hasn't made a loop before, wah pedal location near the input. Like I said before, it's all personal preference. So wherever you feel is best placement for you. But in common practice, I've seen most people use a wah as close to the input as possible. Is basically like what you would consider the standard or like the generalized normal. But I have also seen other cases where people will put distortions before their wah, and the wah just acts as like a big giant distorted filter. So if that's something you want to experiment with, I would definitely say it's worth experimenting, because there's a huge difference in terms of, you know, distortion before a wah and distortion after a wah. So and funny enough, I can actually do that using my GT1000 app here, which is pretty easy. So I'm going to take that distortion pedal. We're going to turn off the compressor, turn on our distortion pedal. We're going to chain edit this guy. We're going to take our distortion pedal and we're going to put it right after our wah. So if I turn on this wah, it might be a little difficult too. Come on. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. It takes a little bit of force to turn on the wah. So if I have a wah, so this is the wah before the distortion. Right, and now let's take that distortion pedal and put it before the wah. Now listen to the difference. So again, it has a little bit of a different effect, and this can actually change depending upon the distortion that you're using. So like, let's say I'm using something like a fuzz, right? Something like with some really, really heavy amount of gain here. So let's do a 60s fuzz. So this is the fuzz after this is the fuzz after the wah. Now let's put the fuzz before the wah. Again, it has a different type of effect, but like it's definitely worth. And in the analog world, it probably will be a little bit different because again, your amplifier might be different, the pedal brands might be different, the distortion inverses to the type of wah you're using might be different. But this is kind of just like a generic, just here's what it kind of sounds like before and a little bit of what sounds like after. But again, since wahs and distortions are both what I would consider dynamic effects, you can really have them as close to the input in whatever order you want. If you like the sound of your guitar compressed going into a wah, that might have a different type of play feel. And again, some of the differences might not just be audio, but just the way it feels to actually play the effect that way. So and that's why I always say, like, if you're messing around with signal chain and signal flow, just give yourself some time to experiment and, like, you know, do some demo recordings and, like, you know, compare the demo recordings of how you sound, you know, and just see if you can hear the differences. practices. So definitely giving yourself and allowing yourself enough time to kind of experiment with those things is definitely worth it in terms of understanding signal flow and how, you know, the effects that you have in front of you can better suit you just by changing their order, you know. Very, very useful thing. But now that we've covered that, I want to get back into looping and just kind of just show you, because people ask me like, what are the 3 effects that you should get, right? Like, what are the 3 things that you should definitely go for? And the 3 that I usually typically say is usually some kind of distortion pedal, right? Some kind of distortion pedal or an amp that has distortion in it. And then the other 2, the other ones I would definitely say would be some type of delay and a looper pedal. And the reason why I say a looper pedal is because looping makes you a better rhythmic guitar player. And let me explain that. So, and people ask me this all the time, how do I get better at my instrument? Learn another instrument. Seriously, learn another instrument. Like if you play guitar and you find that your rhythm is a little bit off, or like, you know, you're just not getting the groove of things, try playing a drum kit, you know, and see what it physically feels like to play a groove. Because I can guarantee you that you take yourself and give yourself a little bit of time to like learn the basic aspects of another instrument. Those basic aspects and core things from that instrument will be applied to all the other instruments that you play. Like I played drums for my middle school drum line, and then I became a professional drummer for a couple of bands like when I was a teenager. And I learned that the rhythmic styles that I was playing were actually implied into my guitar playing. So in fact, playing drums made me a better rhythmic guitar player just because of that. And it can work in the same way, right? If you have a hard time understanding theory on the guitar or understanding how chords are built, learn a little bit of piano, because all the notes are literally right in front of you and you can put them together. And, well, there's a C on that keyboard and there's a C here and a C here on the guitar, right? So if I put those 2 together, wait, hold on, I can get there. There's my 5th. There's my major 7. There's my octave again. There. Or if I want to add the 3rd, there's my 3rd. There's my 5th. So you can kind of break it down and understand it. And allowing yourself to do those things gives you a better education to be a better instrument player in the instrument that you want to learn. So anyway, other than that, I would definitely say looper is a very good rhythmic instrument for the guitar player that maybe doesn't have access to a drum kit or a practice pad. So, and the reason why I say that is because rhythm is needed to make a loop. So, for example, right, I was doing some kind of fancy, whoop, hang on. Oh, sorry. I guess my cable was kind of dying there. Anyway, I was kind of doing some fancy jazz chords and some rhythm chords and stuff, but I'm going to do a little bit of basics just right off the bat with looping, right? So you can actually kind of see from the icon here a little bit, but the floorboard down here, I'm just going to make a basic loop, and I'm going to time it. So basically, I'm going to count myself in, and you're going to hear me count it all the way through to opening and closing the loop. All right, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Recording the loop for 1, 2, 3, 4. Close the loop on the downbeat of 1. And that's basically how you open and close your loop. So in learning how to loop, you kind of already figure out like an internal metronome or just a rhythm guide for yourself, you know? And the fact that rhythm is needed to make a loop, and looping has become such a integral part into modern music and how people interface more with the guitar, or just like, you know, become more creative and being like the one-man band type of guys, you know. But like even having something as simple as like an RC1 or like a small single track looper just for you to like kind of like make loops and make rhythms around, because not only will it like give you more rhythmic practice in that aspect, but you can also use it for so many different things. So for example, a lot of the times when I was giving guitar lessons, right, I would use loopers with my guitar students. You know, sometimes they would come to me after they learned the pentatonic scale. They're just like, Austin, I'm so bored of playing the pentatonic scale. Can we make this more fun and interesting? And I'm like, sure. So one of the things I always like to do is take those students and introduce them to Dorian mode, you know, get a little bit of bluesy in there and stuff. And the way that I always teach them is by using the Santana secret chord progression, which the Santana secret chord progression is A minor 7, dominant D9, and then basically what I can do is implement Dorian on top of this chord progression. So as the loop is playing back, I'll tell my student, like, here's how you play Dorian. That's not the only way that you can, use loopers in a teaching aspect, or just like, in practice with yourself. Another thing I always like doing is working on arpeggios with loopers. So sometimes the loop doesn't even have to be in time. I can just like, play a couple of chords here and just do my arpeggios going up. So I'm going to do a B minor jazz climb up and loop that, and then I basically can play arpeggios on top of it. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, again, it can be a really, really useful tool in so many different aspects of your playing, not just for rhythm and understanding harmony and just for all those educational purposes, but looping is fun. It's really fun just to like lay down like just like a simple chord progression, and you're just sitting there and like you're looping away, and then like an hour and a half goes by and you're like, wow, where'd all the time go? I guess I was really having fun with that. So, and it also allows you to immerse yourself more into the music and be like, listen to your own chord progressions and be like, well, what happens if I added that here instead? You delete the loop, remake the loop again, and you inject a new chord into it, which is very, very awesome. Very, very cool and very keen thing in what I think can advance even the most beginner of guitar player just getting into this aspect, especially when it comes to like looping and playing to yourself and stuff like that. So that's really the main things that I was mainly going to talk about here. But if you guys have any more questions or have any other comments, please feel free to definitely interject into them. Otherwise, I can basically just play a couple of loops and just add in some of my favorite effects here with the GT1000. And yeah, that all sounds great. Ryan, once again, thank you for having me on this. Really appreciate it, man.
Thanks, man. Play away. It all sounds good so far. And it's a really cool idea. Trying some different chords with the looper to get used to playing different modes. It's a really cool way to explore learning some music theory. I really like that.
Yeah, because like it keeps it light, it keeps it fun. It's like because like in making a loop, you kind of have to be rhythmic, and it kind of like just further enforces the whole rhythm thing. Is really what kind of makes the basis of music. Like notes are just notes. But if you play them at a time, it doesn't sound like music. But if you play bad notes in time, they call it jazz, right? So again, it's like it implores that like basics of like just having really good rhythm and timing, but then also using that to kind of like shape maybe making yourself a little bit of a better player, or even just expanding your chord progression knowledge, or maybe you're trying to learn how to be more melodic with your lines, right? So like that's something that I always like doing with a looper too with students, because sometimes like I'll play solos and they'll be like, how do you keep the solo like melodic, like how do you keep it to where like there's like it sounds like having like a vocal quality to it? And I always say it really depends on how you hear it and where you listen back for it. So I'm just gonna make a little just like kind of like a default kind of like chord progression. Let's pick a different key. So I got a basic chord progression there, right? So in making a melodic, in order to make a melodic line, you kind of have to sing it to yourself, right? So in playing this loop, you could be like, and try and play it on the guitar. And again, the line doesn't have to be overly complicated or filled with flourishes or like have all this like, you know, like kind of like crazy tapping stuff, you know, but again, it's all about rhythm, and it's all about like just implying you know, the idea of a melodic line. Like if I'm singing doo doo da da da, or ba da 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 da, you know, you can kind of implore those things in the way you melodically play. So I always encourage that from my students as well. To like play a lead line as if you were to sing it, and if you can't sing it, it's not a melody. I noticed your first boards had lights, not the later ones. Don't need lights anymore. Well, yeah, yes and no. Since the boards had gotten like a lot smaller, I found that like adding the power supplies for the LEDs and stuff just became a little bit cumbersome. So I was like, I don't know. Maybe I could just ditch the lights. But the main reason why I had the lights was because I didn't really know how to build pedal boards to where like the cables were sturdy and everything was like locked down, and like I was using zip ties and stuff like that. So those are in like much later versions of my pedal boards. But in the earlier ones, all the cables were like pretty loose. So I always found that the lights were useful because even if I went underneath the board, I can still see what I'm doing. So it kind of helped me out a little bit in that aspect. But over the years of playing, I just realized that I was just like, yeah, this is kind of more for aesthetic than it is like actually useful, you know. So now underneath my pedal boards, I actually have like a little like touch LED light. You can get them online for like really cheap for like a couple of bucks. But basically, it's just like a little like a silver coin battery, like a little coin battery, and just attach that to an LED and a switch, and I just tap the switch, and it turns on an LED so I can see underneath my board if I need to work on it in the middle of a show. But in the more recent versions of my Dhärä board, I haven't had that much of that problem. You know, knock on wood for now. So, but yeah, I mean, and honestly, like if lights makes you think your board looks cooler, totally put them on there. Go for it. I've seen so many people do so many crazy things with that. I've seen people do like pieces of plexiglass as the pedal board surface, and then they have all these lights going on underneath it, and it goes to the music and it goes to sound and has all these crazy patterns and stuff. And it's like if it makes you feel like you got the greatest pedal board in the world, go for it, man. Because sometimes you need to treat yourself with something a little, you know, non-conventional to kind of be more immersed into your gear. You know, so yeah, good. Actually, a good notice. I never really noticed that until you brought that up. Yeah, some of my earlier versions did have lights on them, and yeah, I don't know. I just kind of just lost the aesthetic of doing it. It was just one of those extra processes after I had already hooked up the power supply and then made all the cables nice and then labeled everything. It's like, oh, I got to go through the extra step of putting lights on it now, like. But yeah, actually, good catch. Never really noticed that. Can you do a table board? I want to twiddle knobs. Sure. You might have a hard time pushing the foot switches while you're playing though. But in most cases, actually, you can use things like MIDI controllers and like little controllers, foot switch controllers, and stuff like that on the floor to control things that would normally be placed on the table. So like a good example is the Boss RC505, and actually in the RC505 Mark II. They're basically designed as tabletop loopers for like beatboxers, keyboardists, and like, you know, hand instrument guys, right? But I have noticed that like a lot of guitar players want to have the power of having a 5-track looper and just loop all sorts of crazy stuff on guitar. So most cases for them, they can't really use it on the floor because the buttons are too soft to be pushed with your foot because it was meant to be on the table. And I tell them just get a couple of foot switches as long as it's got a CTL 1 and 2 input, or if it has MIDI, you can tie a foot switch to it and use that foot switch on the floor to control the thing up top. You'll probably have to do a little bit of research into the specific gear that you're looking for. But I've seen all sorts of different kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, even if you go back to like earlier videos from At the Drive-In, if you guys are familiar with that band, you might be familiar with the other two bands they made, Sparta and Mars Volta. But the singer Omar had a pedal board that was on a keyboard stand, and he would actually sing and manipulate the effects on a tabletop while he was singing. So he'd do all this kind of like crazy like delay warping sounds and like adding phaser and all sorts of cool stuff to his voice, and he's just literally there just tapping it with his hand and turning it as he's singing. Again, he has his hands free because he's singing. We're guitar players, so our hands are kind of gridlocked to the instrument, so it might be harder to just quickly stop playing and then just like tap an effect and then go. But I'm never opposed to using pedals on a tabletop. I do it a lot for recordings actually, because I just have everything set up on a table and it's just easier. And if I pick one effect and I'm recording it, it's just the pedal doesn't even need to be touched. I just punch myself in for the recording and then I'm good to go. But it can, yeah, a table board, that'd be interesting. Unless you had like really long legs and like you can kind of like get your leg all the way up on the table. But yeah, you can use all sorts of foot switches and stuff like that. Like on my new Dhärä board has the little MIDI controller on it. You can use that with a bunch of stuff because the power of MIDI is pretty endless and it goes very, very deep in terms of how you can use it, what you can use it for, what purposes you can have with it. But I say if you don't have to use MIDI, don't use it. If you have to use MIDI, then definitely use it. MIDI is just one of those things that's just like a tool in the toolbox. It's like, oh, for this specific job to hang a drywall, I'm gonna need an impact screwdriver or whatever. I'm gonna need a nail gun. Things like that. What about a board for keyboard? I saw Stevie Wonder use a wah with organ. Yeah, I mean keyboards. I've seen a lot of people use like just like delay pedals on their keyboards for like certain sounds and stuff like that. And even the 505 looper that I mentioned before, I see a lot of keyboard players using that to like loop all sorts of different keyboard parts and stuff. But yeah, the only thing that you might have trouble with certain instruments is their actual output impedance. And by that, I mean the difference between balanced and unbalanced cables. I know guitar players get this mixed up a lot because a lot of our gear is mainly unbalanced instrument cables. So I would just double check the back of your keyboard to make sure, because sometimes if you have a mixed match of impedance, sometimes that can cause volume drops and it can cause just a mismatch of just volume issues that could occur. I mean, I've seen so many setups that basically negate that rule. But yeah, you can technically use that stuff with keyboards. You'd probably actually have more fun with it because then you can get into stereo effects because you have stereo outs on a keyboard. So you can plug that into a delay pedal and do like trippy panning delay stuff, or like ping pong kind of style stuff, or wet and dry for a chorus sound to get like that JC 120 thing. Or even if you want to use mono out of your keyboard, plug it into a wah and a distortion pedal and see what happens. You ever hear what a Fender Rhodes sounds like through a DS1? It sounds great. It's fantastic. But yeah, good one. I never knew Stevie Wonder used a wah with an organ. It's actually very clever.
And actually got a question for you, speaking of stereo effects. So I was listening to your single on Spotify last night, the song Put a Bird on It, which is super cool. You guys should check that out. And it sounded like you're playing some pretty complicated melodies, but with a delay. And maybe it was just a stereo delay, but I know when I put a delay on my guitar and I'm playing sort of complicated melodies, they just clash and the delayed effect doesn't really work with the original. Is there a good way to really get some good separation between your wet and your dry signal when you're using delays like that?
Oh yeah, this is a good one. So, in the recordings that you heard, what we had done was we had basically recorded my dry guitar with the normal setup that I would use with the band, right? So all of my pedal effects, like it didn't change from like the way I perform it to the way I recorded it, right? But what we did in post was we took that dry guitar signal and then we reamped it through just the amplifier by itself. And then all of the stereo effects were imprinted using plugins. But in terms of like how I go about my own recordings, in terms of like, delay and using all that, because again, there's so many different opinions about that specific subject in general. Like, do I print, time-based effects? And sometimes it just depends on the context of the song. If you find that like you're using delay and your delay is like clashing with your sound, or it just sounds like just big washy kind of mess, sometimes if you're going very, very hard on the repeats with the feedback knob, so it's like right at the brink before oscillation, you might want to bring the effect volume down. So that way, like you just basically have this repeating bed of just signal there. Or sometimes for most of my leads, what I do is I'll crank the effect level so that way it's like pretty close to almost doubling my guitar, and I'll turn the feedback like way down to only get like maybe like 1 to 2 repeats. So that way, if I'm doing like a complex melody that has all these kind of like changing keys or changing chords or time signatures and stuff, it's not like the delay, the repeat of the last note isn't going to clash with the chord or the note of the next chord. So you kind of find a little bit of balance with that, and that takes a little bit of time too, because again, I've seen people do like the crazy things with like delayed, like super like just washy type of sound, like kind of like that like shoegazy like type of thing. A lot of those guys like to run like wet dry setups, so sometimes they'll have their dry effects going into a separate output source than their wet effects, which in mixing dry brings out articulation. So the more raw guitar signal or dynamic guitar signal that you can get and mix with other effects, the more articulate and clearer that sound is going to be. So like for example, like if you're using like a lot of fuzz and you play like big jazz chords, right? You don't really hear the nuances of the individual notes because literally the fuzz is compressing that sound so hard that it negates any of the other tones. So sometimes a lot of people would like to take like heavy fuzz and run it in what's called a parallel effect chain, and it basically blends that super high gain fuzz with the original clean tone, so that way you hear a mixture of both. So that way, if I'm playing like more complex stuff on the guitar, or if there's like certain melodies that need to be heard where the note is more important than the effect, that's another way that you can do it. Or you could try the Van Halen way, which is a wet dry wet setup. So if you want to use stereo effects and still have like a heavy wet stereo effect but still have the articulation, you can mix it in with a dry, which is basically your amps going to your guitar is going to 3 separate output sources, and all of the effects are just living in 2 separate output sources in stereo. I mean, there's tons of write-ups on people that have like analyzed Van Halen's wet dry wet rig for most of his tours and stuff like that. But that is another possibility if you want to mess around with stereo effects and you're finding that the delay effect in particular is just like kind of like overall washing out everything. That's probably like some ways that I would go about it. And in reamping my guitar for that EP, I kind of noticed how much difference it makes when you make little changes in like delay effect level or feedback level, or just changing the overall delay algorithm. It makes a huge difference. I hope that mostly answered your question.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, you've been a wealth of information. I really appreciate it. So I guess
man.
unless anybody has any other questions, I went ahead and put the participants in a little raffle to win our $50 gift card. And it looks like Mr. Thomas Mahala is the winner. So congratulations, Thomas.
Woo!
And thank you for all your good questions as well.
Yeah,
and I got your email, so we'll connect about getting that sent out to you. But yeah, Austin, if you wanted to just play for a couple minutes and goof around with some cool sounds, you can go out on that.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you were mentioning like some heavy delay, so I've actually been messing around with this kind of heavier algorithm master delay. I think this one is doing, yeah, this one's one of my favorites. It's doing a Benson Echo Rec type of thing, so very nice. So it kind of like almost like warbles out at the end, which is very nice, RC1 looper, Tom. You won't regret it. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for having me and letting me ramble on about effects and signal flow and all sorts of good stuff. I really liked your questions, guys, and yeah, you will not regret getting an RC1. It's super super fun. If you ever want to know how to use it, you can just feel free to hit me up, man. Right there in product support.
Hey, thanks again, Austin. If I'm ever in New York City, I'll buy you a chopped cheese and you can introduce me to the guys from Deaf Heaven, all right?
There you go, man. Because if you're coming to New York, you can't leave here without getting a chopped cheese, man. You got to get the bodega chopped cheese. That's the way it goes.
Awesome. Well, once again, I'm Ryan Brondike with West Music, based out of Iowa. And this was Austin Sandick, Boss Product Specialist with the New York City band Dhärä. And so happy that everybody joined today. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
This will all be on YouTube.
Thanks for having me, everybody.
Have a good weekend.